This is going to be a talk about, what has occurred with the pandemic, right? From an attack and defense standpoint, how have things changed a little bit? To give you a little bit of background on myself, I'm a father, husband, son. I'm an infosec professional. I do a lot of blue teaming and do some offensive work as well, which primarily this talk will have some offensive implications. I was active duty earlier this year. I was a cyber officer in the Army. I'm still in the reserves. I do have my DD-214 blanket there. And I also teach part-time. So I'm an instructor of cybersecurity. I love to teach. I love to talk. Thank you, VetSec, for the opportunity. Diehard Heat fan. Hey, we got to the finals, but we didn't make it all the way, and that's okay. We got pretty far. So here's what we got on the agenda for today. We're going to talk about how things were before COVID, after COVID, a little bit about the remote users, adversary infrastructure, reconnaissance, how these adversaries are getting valid credentials in 2020. I'll give you guys a quick demo that I think you'll enjoy. What can an attacker do, or what do they do once they gain internal access? And then we'll talk about some threat modeling and defensive considerations. So pre-COVID, and this is something that most organizations kind of employed, this feature of a network where very few worked from home. Maybe your system administrators or the VIPs were VPNing, into the environment. The Outlook web application was still in use, public facing. Your firewall was really your perimeter defense. Internal data storage was very popular, whether it's file servers, et cetera. And then that quote of, sorry, I was on mute, wasn't really a thing. And now we hear it like every day. And here at the bottom, you see the parking lot is fully packed there. But now in COVID, the environment has significantly changed. Some people have never even met their coworkers before. This is federal and public sector. Everyone for the most part is working from home. SaaS and a movement to the cloud has become very popular, as organizations try to be more remote friendly. Working from home endpoint management is very fun, right? I think we can all agree that managing an infrastructure of which resides in residential homes is a bit of a challenge, especially when those users own those specific devices. So they are the owners of the devices, not so much you as a corporate, you assign somebody a laptop. Earlier this year, really, when school kicked off, but even earlier this year, we saw in my organization, with some of the security assessments that we do, the students were given passwords of their last name and their birthdays. So you can imagine how popular, the last name Smith, and you pick a nice, month and year that equates to a specific grade level, how many hits you're able to get. And, work on the plus side, not all was bad. On the positive side, work was very close, depending on how much traffic you have in your residential hallways, there could be toys on the way. So, this is kind of what it looked like. It's a little more dynamic, it's a little more cloud friendly, and it presents a challenge. One of the things many organizations forgot about during this hasty time of migrating to a remote workforce was the users. So, if we ask every organizations out there, hey, when you guys moved to a work from home kind of methodology and infrastructure, did you retrain your users, and did you continue to train your users about what that meant? Meaning the network, the security threats out there, cyber, criminals, what they are doing, et cetera. So these users went home, they started working from home, and a lot of them really had no idea where their data was, when they were VPNing into the corporate environment, what that meant, when they were browsing different sites, what it meant for their DNS logs. So I'm sure some of you have as well. We definitely saw some interesting DNS requests to some interesting sites. So they didn't get this training, right? So what did that really mean for our users? Well, it put them in a bad spot. This is a great GIF or GIF, we won't get into that discussion, but users were left kind of alone and afraid. And when an infrastructure goes after an organization, they're going to go after that human aspect of things with social engineering. So they're going to build infrastructure before to do that reconnaissance, do that enumeration. Once they do that open source intelligence, passive and active recon, then they're going to shift fire a little bit and determine what infrastructure am I going to need as an adversary to conduct my operations, right? And then you start getting into how am I going to get in, whether it's phishing, password spraying, password stuffing. And then some of you may say, hey, we have multi-factor authentication, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Once an attacker has internal access into these work from home laptops, what else do they have access to? Whether it's VPN access, maybe they're able to access tokens with a SaaS authentication token. Can they hook browsers? Can they do an implant on that work from home laptop, et cetera? And then if they have VPN access and they access the VPN, where does that put them on the network? That VPN, quote unquote, VPN subnet, is it flat across your entire network? Is it being monitored? Is it defended a different way? These are some of the considerations people should have thought about. When we talk about the adversary's infrastructure, we need to look at from a defensive standpoint, we got to go back to the basics a little bit. Some adversaries, they register new domains, new infrastructure, and it's less than 30 days old. They use it against you. And some of your defensive tooling should have fired against this type of infrastructure communicating with your environment. Redirectors. When attackers go after an organization, they might not necessarily, just spin up an instance somewhere and launch your attack directly from there. They're going to redirect their traffic through many different ways. One of those ways that we saw was they would exploit smaller businesses, mom and pop shops with a public facing website. They would exploit those websites, and then they would redirect the traffic through those smaller businesses. So that's a little bit unfortunate, but it's realistic, right? They target these smaller organizations with practically no security, and they leverage that infrastructure to launch their attacks. And then those small mom and pop shops, all they get is a knock on the door by the FBI saying, did you know your infrastructure was being used for X, Y, Z? And it's a bit of a sad story there. And then the last piece is they're leveraging cloud to harvest credentials, to redirect their traffic, which will mask them and make them seem legitimate with your many logs as a defender. Right there on the right, you see an example of one of the incident responses that I did earlier this year where they're using Firebase app to mimic the exact replica, Microsoft logon branding of this specific organization. It had the company logo. It looked very similar to the real deal. The only thing that should have stuck out as a sore thumb for this organization was obviously the domain. And unfortunately, the users are not properly trained to really, take a look at these sorts of things, especially when there's company branding involved in Microsoft. Any user will just go in, they see their logo, they type in their creds. Next thing you know, they're logged in and everything is kind of blind to them. So we'll go through a quick scenario here of an adversary conducting reconnaissance. They go through LinkedIn, they find a user that they want to target, and they notice there Microsoft provides us with this specific URL of which we can verify if this organization is using Azure Active Directory. If the namespace is set to manage, then it is. And then we can go out and actually enumerate these users so we can get a valid set of usernames for the specific organization that we're targeting. When you name your email accounts, typically it's first initial, last name, etc. So it's very easy for an adversary to enumerate valid usernames from this cloud provider. The next thing we want to do as an attacker is get some credentials. And these types of tactics are a little bit kind of old school, but they still work. It's one of those things that until we get rid of the space of using passwords and password policies, etc., this will continue to be an attack vector and a tactic attackers will use. So first here, password stuffing is when an attacker, in a realistic standpoint, they go out to the dark web, they get a set of username and password lists. Maybe they were part of a dump. We see those breaches occur all the time. We see the passwords end up in different forums all the time. and they try those username and password combinations at the same time. Password spraying, on the other hand, is when an attacker goes after all your users using a very popular password, whether it's winter 2020, spring 2020, exclamation point, etc. Sometimes you might get lucky with a company name, welcome123. And if those are the default credentials and the users are too lazy, as you can see, Christoph never changed the password, or even if he did, he just put that one because he figured it would be easy for him to know. And that gives an attacker a valid set of credentials within your environment. So a question I would ask for other organizations are, what are your technical and administrative controls for breached accounts? Are your users being notified? Are you changing the credentials frequently? What's your password policy rotation? Is it 30, 60, 90 days? Are you leveraging some of these lists of breach credentials to not be allowed in your environment? Conditional access is very important, multi-factor authentication, etc. Once we get those valid users and that valid password, and we password spray, we're able to get, valid set of credentials, and then everyone kind of throws up the yellow flag here, like the NFL, of, hey, we have multi-factor authentication, so we should be covered. Not necessarily. And I'll say that sometimes, especially with conditional access rules, there may be a way for us to bypass multi-factor authentication as an attacker. One of the ways that I've seen that's actually pretty recent is an organization thinking it's okay to allow Microsoft IP space to not have to go through MFA. Another thing that they do is all internal private IP address from their internal infrastructure doesn't need MFA, because they think, hey, we're in our corporate environment, we don't need multi-factor at that point. If I'm an attacker and I'm gaining internal access to your infrastructure, no MFA will work for your organization. So here's a quick demo of how users are phished and how we can steal some valid session cookies. So here I have a malicious domain, onlinemicrosoft.com. Notice there is no I, and it is a little bit backwards in the naming convention. And I'll let this kind of run here. It is a phishlet. I'm using Evil Engine X2, which is a great tool for phishing. That is the malicious URL I would send to users in order for us to get a valid set of credentials and an authenticated multi-factor authentication token. So the user is phished, they somehow click on the link, and all this traffic is currently being proxied through Microsoft. So you can see how it looks very legitimate. And I'm going to enter my email here. We're going to enter the password. I might have gotten it wrong in this demo. Let's see here. Awesome. So I'm able to authenticate, and then multi-factor comes up, not an issue. I'm still in the middle of this attack chain as an attacker. I'm going to wait for the user to, click their phone and allow it. And then all of a sudden I have the authentication session already within my attacking machine. So if I take a look at the session, I have the username, I have the password. I can use that in a VPN. I can use that in an environment that it doesn't have anything different, and it doesn't restrict with MFA, like, whether you're coming from a specific IP, or maybe some of you have even allowed specific devices to bypass your MFA. Sometimes if you enable Android or iOS, etc., Microsoft actually uses the user agent string to determine the device type. So as an attacker, all I have to do to bypass MFA is switch my user agent string. So again, once we get some valid credentials, and maybe I go as far as getting your MFA token, I can reuse your password across your entire organization, the public facing infrastructure. I can use it against your VPN. Hopefully you have multi-factor authentication on your VPN. Sometimes organizations, they'll pay for one, but they won't pay for another. It's a resources game. Some of these technologies are expensive, and maybe the organization doesn't have the funds to, fund MFA at the VPN level. So that gives me internal network access. Maybe it gives me cloud access. Maybe you have another application out there, password reuse. Maybe I go after your personal email addresses, etc. This is going to give me access to various different things. At a worst case scenario, if I'm inside your environment and I get some remote code execution, whatever, many different ways to get that, I could go after a ransomware attack, which we've all seen in the news. It's very popular. People still pay for the ransoms. Attackers are still trying to ransom other companies, etc. So how do we get after, giving ourselves a chance to win? You can start by threat modeling. And threat modeling is, some of the military folks in the room is really, a little bit of IPB. And that's an Army term, I believe, but intelligence preparation of the battlefield. We need to assess our adversaries. We need to assess what's the most likely and most dangerous courses of action. We need to understand what our attack surface is, where the attackers are going to come in from. Since everybody got pushed out to their house and everybody's working from home, that's a large attack surface. And we need to be able to understand what access all of these users, present to the organization, whether it's, hey, I'm a work from home user, I have login credentials, what can I access from the VPN? If I have access to the VPN, can I reach a domain controller? Can I reach a file shares, etc.? Now you start talking about internal enumeration, internal exploitation, enumerating file shares, exploiting those file shares, etc. It can get pretty crazy. So when we continue our defensive conversation of all these topics, login is crucial. And because everybody's working from home, it does present a bit of a challenge on collecting logs from these work from home, endpoints. So having cloud-friendly tooling is very important. If you're able to issue laptops to your employees, obviously that is a preferred method, though some organizations can't afford to give everyone a laptop. DNS data is very, very valuable. Collect those DNS logs, providers like Cisco Umbrella, etc. They give you some great visibility into where your users are trying to go out to. Your network data, email filtering is huge. So one of the most popular initial vectors is actually phishing. And I think we all know that. Phishing emails. So an attacker actually spends a lot of resources in getting on an inbox, right? So as an organization, you have to protect users from these emails ending up in their inboxes, because if they do, they're very realistic. And when you start talking about what is the probability one of your users is going to click on the link, obviously, we can talk numbers all day, but there is a high risk that depending on the size of your organization, you're going to have at least one user give the attackers that advantage. We talked about breached accounts and how adversaries can leverage those. Take a look at your cloud logins. Are you auditing successful and failure authentications? Microsoft does a great job in the O365 audit logs. They give you source IP, user agent strings, what application they're trying to use, UIDs, what device information. They give you tons of information, so you must leverage those. At the same time, take a look at your on-premise logs. Going back to our corporate kind of defense model before COVID, Windows event logs, 4624, 4625, 4769 with Kerberos TGS requests. These are all very important logs that you should be analyzing for trend analysis, etc. Your VPN net flow. If a user logs into the VPN, are you monitoring that traffic between that VPN subnet and the rest of your infrastructure, right? And I'm going to capitalize here on user training. We ask a lot from our users, and sometimes as security professionals, we tend to judge a little bit too much about users being tricked. But the truth of the matter is this isn't their field. They know some of the basics, but sometimes people are rushed to get to their work emails, etc. So we have to protect our user population in addition to training them. Some of your communicating applications like Zoom and Teams, all of these providers have logs for you as well. Make sure you ingest those into the SIM, determine your users' behaviors. Your conditional access needs to be, leveraged and utilized, and it needs to be fine-tuned to your organization. The type of multi-factor authentication that you use is also a big topic, whether it's SMS or an application such as the Microsoft Authenticator or Authy, etc. Privileged identity management with PIM. This is one of my favorite features from the Azure cloud, where if I'm a global administrator and I need to perform an administrative task, though I have that role, I need to be quote unquote activated to perform those actions. In order for me to be activated, I need to request another global administrator to accept that request. And this is great because you can limit those administrative privileges to, let's say, an hour. So I'm a global admin, I need to perform some admin work, I request the hour access. One of my partners gives me that access, I perform my duties, that time expires, that risk is minimized. So I'm a huge fan of that. We're gonna talk about threat intel feeds here in a little bit. Your backups, as everyone kind of moved to the cloud, what did that mean for backups and storage? A lot of the data started moving to the cloud. It gets very expensive. What happened to your on-premise backups? I'm gonna kind of foot stomp a little bit there on user training once again, and then head into a topic called detection engineering. Detection engineering, it's really a term being used in kind of the blue team side of things, where we have to engineer a detection for adversary tactics. So if we take a look at Attack MITRE and we go after Kerberos as an example, when we do detection engineering, we want to emulate that threat, emulate that tactic, categorize which logs we're going to leverage, how can we detect that infrastructure, maybe categorize some of the tooling, categorize some of the APIs, API calls being used, etc. We really want to determine from start to finish, understand the technical implications of this tactic and how we can defend against it. The reason I explain that is detection engineering looks a little bit different before COVID than after COVID. So I'll let that kind of sink in as you guys determine, why did this really change? It's really because you left from a corporate environment that you secured, you fine-tuned, etc., to everyone is working outside of that scope. And then the last piece here is deception technologies. Deception meaning honeypots, honey users, honey SPN users, honey credentials, honey shares, etc. The term deception technology really expands to anything and everything you can possibly be imaginative of. And I would say that making sure you have deception at a minimum deployed in your DMZ will get you some visibility that you didn't have before. And then I did promise we would talk a little bit about threat feeds. This was a domain that we used for a red team engagement here recently. And even though we had submitted the domains to the tooling that this organization had, which was quite a bit, I won't say any vendors, it still didn't populate over to most other threat intel engines out there. So, it's not a be-all solution to kind of rely on threat intel feeds to tell you whether a domain is malicious or not. Those indicators eventually trickle to our vendors, our products, etc. But really, you have to get after doing some more active analysis on the domains that are occurring in your environment. All right. So that was it. I finished 4 minutes early. We can definitely have questions, but basically all the tooling that I use for this demo, you can check out that GitHub repo there. That's where I'm keeping tabs of some of the Microsoft specifically exploitation tools that I'm using. And you guys can follow me on Twitter, __Arod with a 0. And then my GitHub is just Arod with 2 Ds. And I'm also on LinkedIn, like Spencer mentioned. I'm a huge LinkedIn fanatic. It's a great platform there. And as you guys know, I'm all over Slacks and Discord as well, just like VetSec here. So you guys can likely find me there as well. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'll leave it for any questions or anything.
I have a question, if I may. Knowing what we know now, if you could go back to March, what is like one thing you would implement if possible? for security for work from home?
Sure, that's a great question. If I could go back to March and implement one level of security, it would definitely be multi-factor authentication across all login patterns within my organization. And you know, we still have organizations that don't even use it. But I'll tell you, as an attacker, it makes it that much harder to exploit an organization when multi-factor is, you know, a standard across the board. And even though I showed you kind of one of the ways attackers can get after that, it still takes a lot of resources to kind of get these users, fish these sessions. Hopefully these sessions are weak enough that I can replay them on a different browser and stuff. So it makes it very difficult when users have MFA. And even as an organization that has MFA, that gives you that level of login that you want when users are normally logging in from, let's say Florida, I'm from Florida, and all of a sudden they log in from New Jersey, right? So that's a quick indicator that, hey, there you go. That's a quick indicator that one of your users was compromised and they had no idea about it, but because you had MFA, you just avoided a headache of possibly 2 weeks of work in hopes that that adversary didn't take advantage of it. So that's what I would definitely implement. And organizations are slowly getting after that right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm a big fan of MFA for sure.
Would you even go further, go into Windows Hello for? So Brian, I would. Honestly, the discussion, I had this discussion with a couple of buddies of mine recently actually, but hardware tokens are not that expensive. You know what I mean? Like those times have changed and the military is not the only organization that uses, you know, CAC for authentication. And there are better ones out there. If I was an organization and I wanted to invest in security, I would invest in token authentication, 100%.
All right. Thank you so much, Alberto. That was super interesting. I am having a blast at VetSecCon 2020.